So good evening all. So welcome to our second guest lecture in the series, Research, Reflection and Practices, a forum to learn about doing research. Today we have with us Professor Sasanka Perera to deliver a lecture on social research beyond statistics and quantification, thoughts on archives and historical sources. So most of us may know Sasanka, but for the benefit of those junior researchers who are here today with us, let me briefly give an introduction to Professor Perera. Professor Perera currently teaches sociology at South Asian University in New Delhi and is a founding faculty member of the university's Department of Sociology. He was Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences from 2011 to 2018 and 2021 and 2022, and was the university's Vice President from 2016 to 2019. Prior to moving to Delhi, he was head and professor in sociology at the Department of Sociology at the University of Colombo. Professor Perera's work revolves around conflict, post-conflict, political violence, and trauma. His early publications included stories of survivors, social political context of female-headed households in post-terror southern Sri Lanka, living with torturers, and other essays of intervention, Sri Lankan society, culture, and politics in perspective. Adding to this collection, more recently, is Violence and the Burden of Memory, Remembrance, and Erasure in Sinhala Consciousness, and Tales from Darker Places in Paradise. He has co-edited Culture and Politics in South Asia, Performative Communication, Sociology and Social Anthropology in South Asian Histories and Practices, both published in 2018, and co-written Against the Nation, Thinking Like South Asians, which he published in 2019. This is a snippet from his many publications. His contribution to Sri Lankan vernacular sociology is through the two journals he started, Hatitha in Sinhala and Kanual in Tamil, which has given a greater platform for seminal works of eminent scholars to be translated into these two languages, as well as giving an opportunity for younger scholars to be heard. Professor Perera has three main keen interests in art, photography, and poetry, which he has interlinked to sociology and social anthropology. His visual interest in photographs and sociology comes together in the publication Fear of the Visual, Photography, Anthropology, and the Anxieties of Seeing, published in 2020, and in Art, Intersections of Contemporary Art, Anthropology, and Art History in South Asia, Decoding Visual Works, published in 2019. He has also translated into Sinhala Justine Gardner's short novel, Vita Brevis, A Letter to St. Augustine, in 2019, and Hisashi Inoi's play, Face of Jesus, in 2016, and has co-translated a collection of 150 poems by Jalal al-Din Muhammad Rumi into Sinhala in 2022. His latest co-edited publication this year is Humor and the Performance of Power in South Asia, Anxiety, Laughter, and Politics in Unstable Times, published this year, which I'm eagerly awaiting to read. Professor Perera has a BA in Arts from the University of California, an MA and PhD from the University of Santa Barbara, California. We are pleased to note Professor Perera has been a member of CEPA since 2001, and since September, appointed as board member. Thank you, Professor, for accepting our invitation and sparing your valuable time to be with us and connecting remotely, despite your busy schedule today. Ladies and gentlemen, I warmly invite Professor Sasanka Perera to deliver his lecture on social research beyond statistics and qualification, thoughts on archives and historical sources. Over to you, Sasanka. Thank you.
All right. Okay. I was never too sure how to do this because Center for Policy Alternatives, I always understood to be organizations that generate particular kind of knowledge based on particular kinds of approaches, most of which has to do with dealing with the present, but also dealing with numbers and so on and so forth. And by now, I have moved away from a lot of these things, and simply because I'm old enough to do my own thing. And second, also because intellectually I found it more interesting to dabble in other things other than straight social research, which is the sort of thing that is necessary in the domain of development research. So what I told Indika and whoever else who were in contact at the beginning is that I will try to do two things, keeping in mind quite well that this kind of probably not necessary for in their day-to-day research. Then I'm aware of that, right? But I also think that people should have a life outside of the center too. Personally, I assume they do have a life outside the center, but also intellectually. So that, I was in theoretical terms and methodological terms, we should not be imprisoned by, one or two perspectives. While we can become experts in some, we should be open to a lot more. So this is what I have been doing all my life, I think. So given this, I want to talk about two things. One based on, as I told at the beginning of our conversations with when this lecture was going to be organized, one based on ongoing research, which is incomplete, and the other based on something that is completed, this work I did on photography. But all of this has to do with social research. So that would be the thing that brings everything together. Now, the ongoing research has to do with, it's also contemporary stuff, but it has taken me way deep into the past. And it is that past and the way in which I have used the limited archives is what I want to talk about in this. The research has to do with pilgrimage, Buddhist pilgrimage to parts of India, to Bihar and Uttar Pradesh on the one side, and across the border in Nepal on the other, to Lumbini and so on. So it doesn't sound very complicated when you look at it. So what I wanted to do from an intellectual point of view was not just to look at travel, how people travel and why. We already know that this is a matter of piety. But at the same time, how is the state implicated in these travels? And what kind of landscape do people see in the actual travel? The things like weather border controls and those kinds of mechanisms that only states can implement, to what extent are they implemented as rigorously as we might assume, or are they relaxed because of the nature of this kind of travel? So these kinds of questions for me were both theoretical as well as ethnographic at the end of the day. So they were theoretical questions to begin with, asking about the nature of the state and the nature of the imagination of the past. And then also how are these theoretical issues that is in my head seen in terms of how people actually travel and negotiate borders as part of their pilgrimage travel. Now, this is what I was trying to do. And of course, this was a very contemporary thing. I mean, people travel on a day-to-day, until COVID stopped everything, people were traveling to India and Nepal on a fairly routine basis. And of course, when they traveled to India or Nepal, they did not go to these two nation states. So this is one of my major propositions. They went to some place called Dambadiva, right? Dambadiva is not India, it is not Nepal either. It is something that is purely the land of the Buddha, in which the nation states did not exist, right? And it is not an accident as a result that we have thousands of people going on pilgrimage to these two countries today. But, you talk to them, as I've done, you will know that you will find out very soon that their understandings of the two nation states and the day-to-day cultural lives of people in these two places are pretty low. But that is because they are really not traveling to India and Nepal, right? They are traveling to Damadir. In a way, they are traveling to the past. So what they have in mind is what, the Buddhu Sarana kind of newspaper and all these, we have hundreds of travel literature books that have been published in the Sinhalese language. And also what is taught in textbooks, Buddhism textbooks in schools, and the textbooks or the Ampas and the kind of places that create a particular idea of this place that is not India only. Right? Now, this is the present. Now, you would wonder how this kind of material or research that has to do with the state formation and the unraveling of state practices, as I wanted to look at, have anything to do with the archive. Now, this is what I want to talk about. I think, let me see if I can look at some of my notes. Some years ago, I think 2016 or something, my university had a program in Patna, which used to be known in the time of the Buddha as Pataliputra. And I had to give the keynote address, which I did. And then one of my colleagues said, not to Bodh Gaya, Buddha Gaya in Singapore, which I did. And just outside the temple, Bodh Gaya's main temple, is a pretty not so well maintained museum, the Bodh Gaya Museum of the Archaeological Survey of India. And in it, I found this very insignificant looking artifact. It was a kind of a part of a stone fence. But this is what the fence, this is what the description from the museum people said about that artifact, right? It said, in the 5th century AD, the magnificent Mahabodhi temple was constructed. That is a reference to the Buddha Gaya's main temple, this iconic thing that all of you know. Then the second line said, a monastery was also built by the king Meghavarman of Sri Lanka for his monks. Now, it is this sentence that kept me very confused, because I thought I was fairly familiar with Sri Lankan history, and I've never heard of a guy called Meghavarman. And I thought, I assumed in my own arrogance that the archaeological people in India have got this thing wrong. But I realized later that Meghavarman is a reference to the king in the latter part of Anuradhapura period, we know as Kitsirimevan, or the Sinhala literature generally refer to him as a pious king. Now, what I wanted to know, and it is from this moment onwards that from this kind of marginal realization, my research that had to do with the present went way back into the past, right? Into the Anuradhapura period, because I saw this reference. And I started looking for information on what this was all about. So the first, those of you who are in Sri Lanka in the local school system or university system would know that Kitsirimevan is known as a king, as a pious king who built various Buddhist infrastructure in the country, in the island, but there's no reference to him in the local literature of doing anything outside. Now, this was a reference to this king building something in what we call India today, not very close to our borders, but way inside contemporary Bihar state. Now, I wanted to know whether it's some passing thing because, and there was a reason why I wanted to look at this. And that is because my understanding of pilgrimage as we understand it today, I assumed it is a 19th century practice. 19th century onwards, particularly with the intervention of Anagarika Dharmapala, and that is also reasonably well documented. I'll talk about that also with reference to archives. But obviously I was wrong. We don't know much about it, but historians do know that this construction activity took place. So when I dug into, here is the beginning of the archival part of this, my research. I thought, okay, where can I find out about this building construction process? Because my whole story I thought would be kind of reoriented if this kind of pilgrim practice pre-existed colonial period in a reasonably large scale. So I looked at, it was not that difficult to get access to material in the Nehru Memorial Library in New Delhi and also the Archaeological Survey of India, looking at, reports that had to do with the excavations in Bodh Gaya. And I found these 1890 something papers and books by a man called Alexander Cunningham, who has some very detailed reports of both the excavation of this Bodh Gaya main temple, as well as what is known as the Mahabodhi monastery, and the one that is supposed to have been built by right? Now, I'm not a trained historian. I'm not that well trained to look at archives and historical material, but as part of the general training that all of us have, to some extent, you have to sit down and be cautious about the way in which you dabble with the past, which I did. And I want to narrate to you some of the things that I discovered, because all of this is what I would call archival research, which was not that challenging to do. It is not that challenging because some of this I could do. The other, it has also the material from places like, how do I put this clearly? Things like, what's this guy who was living in Sri Lanka in the Kandyan period? I forget. But anyhow, this is a kind of an archive that is fairly easily accessible, and I want you to keep that in mind, because most people nowadays think that doing archival research necessarily pre-assumes that you have to somehow go to some place like the National Archives in Sri Lanka or wherever. Now, those are important places, but internet-based resources are also widely accessible now, and also some of them are fairly reliable. Now, what I learned from these archives, I just want to give you a few examples as the kind of thing you can find out. In my case, with reference to this particular building project, I found that the earliest detailed information on this construction effort by Kitsiri Mewan was actually recorded by a Chinese traveler called Huan Sang in between 602 and 664 Christian era. This is when he lived. In his account of Bodh Gaya, and there's a fairly detailed account by this man, written in 629 CE, he offers a fairly detailed narrative explaining why this was built by the king of Ceylon deeply within Indian territory. And he goes, and remember, now this Chinese report is from 300 years after the construction is supposed to have taken place. So the monastery that was built lasted at least for 300 years. And we know that another 200 years later, there were other Chinese reports also detailing both the the context in which this was built, and also I'm not sure how much you lost. I did not know I was offline. Indika, what did I say last?
You were talking about the Chinese.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Maybe not that much, hopefully. I mean, this will happen. Unfortunately, something's going on. So the point is this. These kinds of material, which we don't usually dabble in, but which are nevertheless fairly easily accessible, gives us a very, very different picture of our history. The kind of history that we usually don't talk about, that we usually don't think about. Now, if I am to take this Sosa seriously, and we know that the Chinese travelers, both Buddhist travelers, monks, as well as military and diplomatic travelers, kept fairly accurate records, and these seem to be in that genre. One of the things it says consistently is that because the Sri Lankan monk was mistreated in India as a foreigner, he came and complained to, it says, his brother, the king, and he basically wrote to send jewels and so on and so forth to Chandragupta, Samudragupta, sorry, who was the emperor at that time, and asked to build Sri Lankan temples, Sri Lankan monasteries in all the places where the Buddha had been to, all of it. So, but the permission came only to select one place, according to these Chinese records. And he built it in Bodh Gaya, right? And this is the temple, this is the monastery that still there are some remnants of, but most of the pilgrims who go there don't have the foggiest idea about this. Now, why did I say this very long story? Because to make one simple point. Now, even though I was working very much in the present about contemporary, focusing on contemporary travels, I would not have been able to make this research as comprehensive as I wanted to if I had not gone into the past, as in this case. And the only way in which I could have done it was by looking at certain kinds of archives. And these Chinese archives, which are now, since the 19th century, English translations have been available, and they are very reliable. I managed to access some mostly in India, but also one or two in Royal Asiatic Society office in Colombo. And I got the sense that nobody reads these things. These are just old records. And the second archive that I have browsed through so far, but haven't really gone into in detail, is also Mahabodhi Society library in Colombo, as well as Mahabodhi Society archives in Kolkata and Sanchi. And if you want to look at material for the 19th century, from Anagarika Dharmapala's diaries and so on and so forth, and Sinhala about their newspapers and so on, these are the kinds of papers that gives a fairly good access. Now, for my kind of research, even though I'm working in the present, it is very difficult to stop myself in the present. This is what I'm trying to say. And often I have to go back to the past because our present is always implicated by our understandings of the past, right? So this is why Stephen Kemper, when he wrote that famous book on Sri Lankan Chronicles, said that Sri Lanka's past is always present in the present. I mean, for us, the past is as important as the present, right? Because we reorient our contemporary living and times and ownership of land, all these things based on our understanding of the past. So this is, you can't really not deal with it. So in my sense, even though I'm better trained to deal with the present, I had no choice in this case but to deal with the archive, right? Two different kinds of archives. Now, now I don't think that, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong at some point, that the kinds of research that Center for Policy Alternatives usually does, I don't think you need to access archives of this kind. You might have to look at some newspapers going 10 years back or whatever. But it's also, I think, some kind of a training in how to use archives is actually quite useful, because, as I said at the beginning, assuming that some of you people want to, when I say people, I mean the researchers, might want to do something beyond consultancies, do something beyond the CEPA's, bread and butter research, and do something, something broader, something more creative, like a book, and so on and so forth. So this is why I thought that that I should talk about this in the context of a person who is usually dealing with day-to-day contemporary things, but had to go to the archives, right? But of course, if you want to talk only about archives, then we have to get someone like Nira Wickramasinghe, who does a much better job, to come and talk to you. So this is the first part of what I want to say, and that is about using the archive. The second part I wanted to discuss was about photography, because partly because this is also a interest of leisure for me, but it is also something that I've been asking questions in a methodological sense for the last 10 years. So this book, that a picture of which Indika showed, is something that has come out asking these methodological questions. Now, let's put it this way. People do use photographs in all sorts of things, mostly to illustrate things on the cover and inside and so on and so forth. But these are about decorations, right? My interest is to find a more serious way of incorporating photos as a mainstream research method in social research. Now, I'm not sure to what extent this might be useful for day-to-day research of the center, your center, but this is not something that has been taken very seriously in my own discipline. When I say my discipline, I mean both sociology and anthropology in the mainstream, because what has happened is that anything to do with images, photographs as well as painting, sculpture, those kind of things have been exiled into something called visual sociology and visual anthropology. They can do all those things in those subdisciplinary domains, but not in the mainstream. And that, I think, is because photographs or images more generally have not been really very clearly understood in methodological terms in contemporary social sciences in general. And partly because we look at photographs as soft material, as opposed to statistics, which are considered hard material, scientifically provable and quantifiable and so on and so forth. I would consider photographs taken either taken in the process of research or from an archive fairly seriously, as long as you know what to do with them. Now, you can't take them out of context, right? Now, the point is this, given the importance of the captured image, let's look at only photographs for the moment. Now, capturing of an image means the freezing of history and time and space. So you take a picture, I mean, assuming that it's not doctored and so on, then it's a freezing of a moment. Now, that moment is a matter of history, right? And that is the kind of history that it is like history in a capsule that you might want to revisit as part of research. So my question, the question that I've tried to pose in this book and in recent times is, why is it that photography has not been taken very seriously as a legitimate object of research, as well as a repository of information in mainstream social research? I mean, this is the question that you can ask yourself. It is not that, if you look at the history of anthropology, you will see that it has been implicated by photographs for a very long time, since at least the latter part of the 19th century. In the context of the birth of anthropology itself, when European colonization and imperialism spread to our part of the world, one of the first things that were done was to photograph these strange people, meaning us, Africans, Latin Americans, and so on and so forth. So it's not that photography was not implicated in our kind of discipline, but as David McDougall says, the problem for at least anthropology was that it seems to, historically, it seems to have been confused as what to do with photographs. And I think that confusion remains even today when it comes to other social science disciplines, including social research more generally. Now, let me give me a second. I want to cut short certain things. Okay, one. I think the problem is that there are a number of anxieties embedded in thinking of photographs as possible sources of information. Now, Marcus Banks, who does use photographs quite a lot in his writing, has noted in a 1980s text that ultimately what he considers good visual research rests upon a judicious reading of both internal and external narratives. Now, what does internal narratives mean here? And my interpretation is that if you are referring to a photograph, internal narratives simply mean the kinds of information that is embedded within the frame of a photograph, right? There are a lot of things. You take a picture, you already see certain things within the frame. External narratives, I think, are far more important because those are the kinds of bodies of knowledge, information that that remains outside the frame. You can't see these things. But if a photograph is to be used in a research context, you need to know that context too, that what is outside the frame. For example, who took the picture, when, why, for whom? Those kinds of questions have to be posed and answered if a photograph is supposed to make methodological sense, right? Then I want to refer to a very similar concern that Elizabeth Edwards, who also has worked quite a lot with photographs and also has talked a lot about visual methods, has said about photograph. And this is what she says. And this is also, I think, a very important point of departure when you are thinking, if anybody is thinking of using things like photographs in research. She asked this question: what work is expected from photographs as objects in albums, on walls, at shrines, in political protests, as gift exchange, right? So what do you do with photographs? Then she also asked, under what material conditions are photographs taken? This is what I was referring to before. Before you use a photograph in a research context, you need to understand who and why it was taken, by whom and why. Now, if you take, for example, this famous book on the Vedas, I think published in 1912 or some such thing by the Seligmans, called the Vedas. One of the, and it has these very interesting pictures that of the Veda people that contemporary writers reuse all the time. But there's something that the Seligmans say at the very beginning. Now, this whole research was funded by the colonial government. So when an entity, let's forget the colonial government, let's say the Sri Lankan government of contemporary times wants CEPA to do a research. Now, when an entity like the colonial government or contemporary national government funds a research, there are certain expectations. This is not only about science. This is not only about scientific findings. This is also about political posturing, isn't it? So if you look at the Vedda research, you don't see the kind of poverty that we know that existed in those times, in those places, right? You also don't, because that was not part of the colonial project, to make that so apparent in a book that they published. I would say the same is about contemporary times. Now, if the Sri Lankan government or any government sponsors a bit of research, we know this has happened. It's not only about photographs, it's also about information and interpretation that certain things have never been published. This happened to me too. There are a lot of works a lot of research I've done for various state entities when they ask me in consultation, in collaboration with, when I used to work for the World Bank and after. I think those reports must be collecting dust, because anything critical, they don't seem to come out. The same will be the case with photographs. Discomforting photographs cannot be used in these kinds of situations. So that is the fundamental question you have to ask. Who took a photograph, when and why, right? But then the point is, even if photographs of this kind may not have been used in a particular project, they still remain in archives in many cases. So it is up to social researchers or contemporary times to go and look for these things and see whether they can narrate the kind of stories that were not necessarily meant at that time, because you will be now asking different kinds of questions, right? You know that the conditions under which these pictures were taken. You know that much better. You know who had agency in taking these photographs and who did not. These were things that did not apply at that time, right? So, okay, one more thing and then we are done. So what we'll do is this. I wanted to simply make 2 points, and that is, even though this is probably not the kind of research that you do, to me, things like the archive, whether it's textual archive or pictorial archive on one hand, and photographs from contemporary research as well as photographs taken by others are matters of, or I would say are repositories of information. It allows me to interpret things. It allows me to understand certain social contexts and histories that otherwise I would not have access to, right? So right now, my interests have shifted to these kinds of things because I have the freedom to do it and I have the leisure to do it, right? Now, but this doesn't mean that archives or photographs can be used out of context. So this is the last thing I want to say. Now, people can take a picture, from somewhere and make the kind of claims about it that the internal references that I talked about before or the external references to that photograph simply won't sustain, right? So a photograph, if you use it in a methodological sense, or archival material, if you use it in a methodological sense, have to be put in context, that they cannot be means of overinterpretation, right? That whether you go into the 5th century, as I was trying to do in this pilgrimage research, or if you are going to the colonial period, as I was doing with photographs, colonial period, and also much more recent times. You can't use these things to narrate a story that is not narratable. It has to be methodologically sound. And there is one more thing I want to say about photographs, and then we will see if you have any conversations on this. And that is, photographs is not something that is easy to not think about. Everybody is a photographer. Everybody who has a mobile camera is now a photographer. And you will be surprised at the kind of pictures that are taken. And it has impacted so many things. We know what people eat. We know where they eat it. We know where people go. I mean, I can't keep a secret. I never tell people that when I come to Sri Lanka, because it's so that I could be left alone. But that doesn't usually work, because somebody sees, take a photograph and put it on Twitter, and then everybody knows. So what I'm trying to say is, photographs, unlike any other means of communication, has become a very powerful and important tool today. So this is not something you can easily avoid, right? Now, I think it's much more useful to think of it in methodological terms than simply discard it, which is what I'm trying to do. But of course, my kind of work has just begun. Now, whether this is something Center for Policy Alternatives wants to do at this difficult time in our countries, and also, in Colombo itself, is something that only you can answer. But all I'm saying is, try to think outside the box at least some of the time, as you master your bread and butter methods, which you need to do to do the kind of work you are doing, right? But now, if you want to go further in this, at some point in the future, maybe I can help organize with colleagues in Delhi and beyond something far more focused. What I just want to do today is to throw out these ideas and see whether there's an interest. Okay, Indika, I think this is okay for the moment.
That we can wrap up this session, and thank you once again, Professor Perera, for taking time off, and also maybe we can have a continuing conversation on this as we go, and I think a lot of people in that. And I also want to remind everyone about our next guest lecture. It's by Dr. Dharini Rajasingham Senanayaka. It's titled, Where Have All the Fish Gone? Ethnography of Globalization and Reflexive Research Beyond the Indian Ocean Anthropocene. Hope all of you will be able to join us on that day too. It will also be a virtual guest lecture series. Thank you once again. Thank you all.
Thank you.
For joining us.
Thank you.